There's a place in the world where the wind never stops, a vast, frozen expanse of grass and stone that stretches for thousands of miles in every direction, where winter temperatures plunge far below zero, and survival is not a right, it is something you fight for every single day. This is the Mongolian steppe, and it was here, around the year 1162, somewhere near the banks of the Onon River, that a child was born who would one day change the course of human history. He was not born into power. He was not born into comfort. He was born into a world where men lived and died by the blade, where tribes raided each other without warning, where a boy who lost his father was a boy left to die. According to ancient accounts, this child came into the world clutching a clot of blood in his right hand, an omen, those around him whispered, of what was to come. His name was Temüjin, and the world had no idea what it was about to face. This is the story of Genghis Khan, a story that begins with a child abandoned on the frozen steppe and ends with an empire that stretched from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Eastern Europe. It is a story of survival, of ambition, of ruthless genius, and of the tragic truth that the things we build with our own hands are often the first things to destroy us. Stay with us, because this story is unlike anything you have ever heard. The steppes of Mongolia in the 12th century were not a place for the weak. There were no kingdoms, no courts, no permanent cities. Life was organized around clans and tribes, nomadic groups that moved with their herds across the endless grass, bound together by blood ties and the constant threat of their neighbors. Alliances were made and broken in a season. Trust was a luxury few could afford. Temüjin was born into the Borjigin clan, the son of Yesugei, a tribal chieftain of modest influence. His early years, by all accounts, were not entirely without joy. He rode horses before he could properly walk. He hunted with his brothers in the vast open plains. And when he was around 9 years old, his father took him east, deep into the territory of the Kongirad tribe, to arrange a future marriage for the boy with a girl named Berthe, a union that would one day prove more consequential than anyone could have imagined. But Yesugei never made it home. On his return journey, he was offered food and hospitality by a group of Tatar warriors, the very people who had long been enemies of the Mongol clans. It was a trap wrapped in courtesy. The Tatars poisoned him. By the time word reached Temüjin, his father was already dying. He was 9 years old, and his world was about to collapse entirely. Without their patriarch, the Borjigin clan did something that tells you everything about the brutal arithmetic of steppe politics. They abandoned the family. Yesugei's followers, unwilling to share their scarce resources with a widow and her children, simply left. Hoilun, Temüjin's mother, was left alone in the wilderness with 7 children and almost nothing to eat. They survived by gathering roots and berries, by fishing the cold rivers, by doing whatever was necessary to make it through each day. For a lesser person, this would have been the end of the story, but Temüjin was not a lesser person. Even in those early years of desperate poverty, something was already forming inside him, a cold, calculating understanding of the world as it truly was, not as it should be, as it was. A world where you were either strong or you were forgotten. A world where mercy offered carelessly was indistinguishable from weakness. A world where the only currency that truly mattered was power. But before he could pursue power, he had to survive something that would have broken most men. Around 1177, when Temüjin was a teenager, he was captured by a rival clan, the Taiyichiud, the very people who had abandoned his family after his father's death. They enslaved him, forcing him to wear a kang, a heavy wooden device locked around his neck, a symbol of his degradation. He was a prisoner, a nobody, a boy from a dead man's clan. He had nothing. He was worth nothing. Except that he escaped. With the help of a sympathetic guard named Sorkun Shira, a man whose quiet act of compassion history has largely forgotten, Temüjin slipped away in the darkness, hiding in the cold currents of a river to avoid recapture. He survived the night. He survived the pursuit. And when the sun rose again over the Mongolian steppe, Temüjin emerged from that river, not as a victim, but as something new, something harder, something that had been tested in the fire of humiliation and had not broken. The years that followed were a slow, methodical ascent. Temüjin forged alliances, first small, then larger. He rallied followers not with promises of comfort, but with something more compelling: loyalty. In a world where betrayal was constant and alliances were paper-thin, Temüjin offered his followers something radical. He promoted men based on ability, not bloodline. He shared the spoils of war with those who served him. He remembered every favor and every insult, and he repaid them both in full. Then came the moment that would set the final stage for his transformation. Berthe, his wife, the woman he had married in fulfillment of his father's last arrangement, was kidnapped by the Merkits, a rival tribe. For many men of that era, a stolen wife was a wound to pride that was mourned and then accepted. But Temüjin was not many men. He gathered his allies, including his powerful patron Toghrul Khan of the Karaites, and launched a rescue mission of extraordinary boldness. He got her back. And in doing so, he proved to everyone watching that this man, this former slave from a forgotten clan, was someone to be taken seriously. By 1206, after decades of wars, alliances, betrayals, and battles across the Mongolian plateau, Temüjin had done what no one before him had ever managed. He had united the warring tribes of Mongolia under a single banner. At a great assembly on the banks of the Onan River, the same river near which he had been born, the chieftains of all the Mongol clans gathered and proclaimed him their supreme leader. A shaman declared that the sky god Tengri himself had chosen this man to rule, and from that moment forward, Temüjin ceased to exist. In his place stood Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the master of all who live under the sky. The boy the world had forgotten was about to make sure the world never forgot him again.
To understand what Genghis Khan unleashed upon the world after 1206, you first have to understand what his army was. It was unlike anything that had existed before it. The Mongol forces were not simply soldiers on horses. They were a military machine of terrifying sophistication, disciplined in a way that the armies of sedentary civilizations, with their rigid hierarchies and slow-moving infantry, were entirely unprepared for. Genghis reorganized his forces on a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. Every man knew his role. Every commander was chosen for competence, not for his family name. Speed was their weapon, deception was their art, psychological warfare was their secret edge. They would sometimes allow a handful of survivors to escape from a defeated city, not out of mercy, but by design. Those survivors would flee to the next settlement and bring with them the most potent weapon of all: terror. Word would spread ahead of the Mongol advance like a plague wind, and one city after another would open its gates without a fight, calculating that submission was better than annihilation. Often they were right. Cities that surrendered were typically spared. Cities that resisted were erased from the earth. The first great target was the Xi-Sha kingdom to the south, which fell after a campaigning in 1207. Then came the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China, a civilization of millions fortified by the Great Wall itself. Genghis Khan did not fight the wall, he went around it. By 1215, The Jin capital of Zhongdu, the city that would one day become Beijing, had fallen. The Mongols stood at the gates of China, and the ancient empire of the East trembled. But it was to the west that Genghis Khan would author his most devastating act, and in doing so, revealed the depth of his fury when the world dared to disrespect him. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful Islamic state that controlled Persia, Afghanistan, and the great trading cities of Central Asia, including the legendary Samarkand. He wanted commerce, not war. He sent his emissaries in good faith, with valuable goods and a message of peace. The governor of the Khwarezmian city of Otrar had them all executed. The merchants, the envoys, every last one of them. When the news reached Genghis Khan, those who knew him say a silence fell over his camp that was more frightening than any war cry. He climbed alone to a mountaintop. He prayed to the sky. And when he came back down, he unleashed upon the Khwarezmian Empire a campaign so total, so absolute in its destruction, that historians still struggle to find adequate words for it. Within 3 years, the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states in the world, ceased to exist. The cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and Nishapur were sacked with a thoroughness that staggers the imagination. Populations that had built those cities over centuries were scattered to the winds. Ancient libraries, mosques, and irrigation systems that had sustained human life for millennia were destroyed. Contemporary accounts speak of rivers running black with the ink of burning books and red with blood. The Shah of Khwarezm fled and died alone on a small island in the Caspian Sea, a broken man, his empire nothing more than memory. And yet, and this is the contradiction at the heart of Genghis Khan, this same man who ordered those massacres also created a law code that banned the enslavement of Mongols. He established religious freedom across his entire empire, allowing Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and animists to practice their faiths without fear. He built a postal system that stretched thousands of miles. He promoted men of talent regardless of their birth. He outlawed the torture of prisoners, at least among his own people. He was simultaneously the most destructive force of his age and one of its most progressive administrators. In 1227, during a campaign against the rebellious Western Shah, a people who had dared to defy him, Genghis Khan died. He was somewhere between 60 and 65 years of age. The exact cause of his death remains one of history's most debated mysteries. Some accounts say he fell from his horse. Others suggest illness, possibly contracted during the harsh campaigning conditions. What is certain is that he had requested years before to be buried without any markings in the Mongolian tradition, so that no enemy could desecrate his grave and no cult could grow up around his tomb. His wish was honored. His burial place has never been found. To this day, the resting place of the man who shook the world remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of antiquity. He left behind an empire that covered more land than any ruler before him had ever controlled, and a question that history would spend the next century trying to answer: could anyone hold it together? Before we continue, what do you make of this story so far? A child abandoned, enslaved, and left for dead who rose to conquer half the known world. Do you think Genghis Khan was primarily a destroyer or, in his own way, a builder? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The answer may surprise you when you hear the rest.
Genghis Khan had 4 principal sons by his first wife, Borte: Jochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. And before he died, he named Ogedei as his successor. It was, by the standards of the time, a relatively orderly transition. Ogedei was capable, expansionist, and determined to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. Under his rule, the Mongol Empire reached new heights. It was Ogedei who sent his nephew, Batu Khan, and the brilliant general Subutai westward into Europe with an army that tore through Poland and Hungary like a storm in the winter of 1241. The knights of medieval Europe, The finest heavy cavalry of the Western world were destroyed at the Battle of Legnica and the Battle of Mohi in the same week. The Mongols reached the shores of the Adriatic Sea. Vienna lay open before them. The courts of France and England prepared for the end of Christendom. And then, nothing. The Mongol advance halted. Word had reached Batu Khan that Ogedei had died, and he turned his armies eastward to participate in the selection of a new great Khan. Europe was saved, almost by accident, by a death thousands of miles away. This episode reveals everything you need to know about the fatal vulnerability built into the very structure of the Mongol Empire. It was an empire held together not by institutions, not by laws, not by shared culture, but by the personal authority of one man at the top. And when that man died, the system cracked. The selection of each new great Khan required the agreement of the Mongol nobility at a Kurultai, a great assembly. But as the empire grew larger and the descendants of Genghis Khan multiplied, those assemblies became arenas of political warfare. Factions formed, alliances were made and betrayed. Brothers turned against brothers, cousins conspired against cousins. The sons of Genghis Khan had been warriors. His grandsons were politicians, and not always skilled ones. By the time of Möngke Khan's death in 1259, the cracks had become chasms. Two of his brothers, Kublai Khan and Arik Boke, went to war against each other for the throne. The civil war that followed, the Toluid Civil War, split the empire from within, and when it ended, the fiction of a unified Mongol state was over. What emerged in its place were four separate khanates: Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia under Hulagu, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in the Western Steppes and Russia. These four khanates were all descended from the same great man. They all called themselves Mongol, and within a generation, they were at war with each other. Kublai Khan, the most famous of Genghis's grandsons, extended Mongol rule to encompass all of China, establishing the Yuan dynasty and famously receiving the Venetian traveler Marco Polo at his magnificent court in Khanbalik, the city that is today Beijing. His capital was a wonder of the age, an enormous planned city of broad avenues and ornate palaces, where ambassadors from a dozen nations mingled with Mongol warriors, Chinese scholars, and Persian merchants. For a brief, glittering moment, it seemed as though the vision of a Pax Mongolica, a Mongol peace that connected the whole world through trade and law, might actually endure. But the strains were already showing. Kublai Khan's armies failed twice to conquer Japan, their fleets destroyed by storms that the Japanese would call kamikaze, the divine winds. His campaigns into Vietnam and Southeast Asia faltered against the heat, the jungles, and the fierce resistance of peoples who had learned that the Mongols were not invincible. The costs of these failed campaigns drained the empire's treasury and exhausted its people. And then came something no army could fight. In the middle of the 14th century, a disease began moving along the trade routes of the Mongol Empire, the very routes the Khans had built and protected. The Black Death arrived in Central Asia and spread west with devastating speed. Historians estimate that it killed as much as a third of the population of Europe and comparable proportions of Asia. It shattered the economic networks that had sustained the Pax Mongolica. It emptied cities. It broke the fragile administrative structures that had held the khanates together. Across the empire, populations that had suffered under Mongol taxation rose in rebellion. In China, a peasant leader named Zhu Yuanzhang rallied a massive uprising against the Yuan dynasty. In 1368, his forces took Khanbalik and proclaimed a new dynasty, the Ming. The last Mongol emperor fled north to the steppe,
where their ancestors had come from. China was gone. In Persia, the Ilkhanate had already collapsed decades earlier, fragmenting into regional warlordisms as the descendants of Hulagu failed to produce capable successors. In the western steppes, the Golden Horde was tearing itself apart through dynastic feuds. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate would linger for centuries in one form or another, but as a ghost of what it had once been. By the end of the 14th century, the largest empire in the history of the world had dissolved, not in a single catastrophe, but in a slow, decades-long unraveling, each thread pulling loose until nothing remained of the whole. The man who united the Mongol tribes by sheer force of will and genius built an empire that depended entirely on that will and that genius. When he was gone, no one else had enough of either to hold it all together. There is a profound irony in the story of Genghis Khan. He was born into a world that had no use for him, abandoned, enslaved, left to die in the cold. He transformed himself into the most powerful human being who had ever lived, and he stamped his mark on the world so completely that even today, 8 centuries later, genetic studies suggest that roughly 16 million people on Earth are his direct descendants. He connected East and West through the Silk Road, facilitating an exchange of goods, ideas, and diseases that would ultimately reshape the entire planet. And yet, everything he built required a strength it could never permanently possess. The empire that bore his name outlived him, but it could not outlive the contradictions he had embedded in it. An empire conquered by a man who valued loyalty above all else, but who never created a system that could survive without him. Genghis Khan left the world a question dressed up as a legacy. What does it mean to build something that lasts? To all of you who have stayed with this story until the very end, thank you, truly. You have just witnessed one of the most extraordinary journeys in all of human history, from the frozen banks of the Onon River to the gates of Vienna and the courts of China. You stayed through every chapter, every rise, every fall, every moment of impossible triumph and inevitable ruin. That dedication deserves to be recognized, and it means everything. The greatest chapters are never really over. They live on in the questions they leave behind. Was Genghis Khan a monster or a visionary, a destroyer or an unlikely architect of the connected world we live in today? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Your perspective matters. And if this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see the ancient world in a new light, then do not let the journey end here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next, because the next story we have prepared for you reaches even further back into the depths of antiquity, and it is, if anything, even more extraordinary than this one. The best is always still to come.